Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 27th of November. I'm Andrew Wilson, and welcome to the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 277 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our two guests for this afternoon, and then together we will look in a little more depth at the past week's headlines from Scotland and around the world. First, here is the update from Ukraine. There are growing fears that Russia's relentless targeting of Ukraine's electricity grid will threaten the safety of the country's nuclear power plants in the wake of an unprecedented emergency shutdown on Wednesday. Petro Kochin, the president of Ukraine's nuclear power company Energoatom, said all safety mechanisms had worked as intended on Wednesday, but two generators were damaged in the process. Ukrainian authorities are gradually restoring power, aided by the reconnection of the country's 4 nuclear power plants, but millions of people are still without heat or electricity after the most devastating Russian airstrikes of the war so far. Russia kept up its onslaught on Ukrainian cities on Saturday with an attack on Dnipro, which injured 6 people and destroyed 7 houses, said the regional governor, Valentin Rezinchenko. 32 civilians have been killed in Kherson since the 9th of November, when Russian forces withdrew from the southern city they had occupied for 8 months. Since then, Russian troops have continued to shell Kherson constantly. Ukraine has accused the Kremlin of reviving the genocidal tactics of Joseph Stalin, as Kyiv commemorated the Holodomor, which was the Soviet-era famine that killed millions of Ukrainians in the winter of 1932 to 1933. Vladimir Zelensky hosted a summit in Kyiv with allied nations on Saturday to launch a Grain from Ukraine initiative to export $150 million worth of grain to the countries most vulnerable to famine and drought. Up to 60 Ukrainian grain ships can be sent by the middle of next year to some of the world's poorest countries in Africa, according to the Ukrainian president. Belarus's longtime foreign minister, Vladimir Makai, has died. Makai had been due to meet Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, in Minsk on Monday. The prime ministers of Lithuania, Poland and Ukraine, Ingrida Simoniti, Mateusz Morawiecki and Denis Shmyhal, respectively, met in Kyiv yesterday for talks to discuss and to reiterate their commitment to work together in countering Russia's armed aggression. Russia is now firing aging cruise missiles stripped of their nuclear warheads at Ukrainian targets because Vladimir Putin's stocks are so depleted, the UK's Ministry of Defence has suggested. An intelligence update from the ministry on Saturday said the desperate improvisation by the Russian president's struggling forces were unlikely to achieve reliable effects. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined today by two fantastic guests on the Full Scottish. Fiona Grahame was born and raised in Edinburgh and educated there and in Dundee. She was a primary teacher in the capital and then in Orkney, where she moved more than 30 years ago. She was the head teacher on the island of Flotta, and she is now a freelance journalist and the editor of Orkney News Limited. Fiona, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Fine, thank you, Andrew.
Well, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us today on the Full Scottish. And Paul McLennan MSP has been the MSP for East Lothian since 2021. Previously, he served as a local councillor for the Dunbar and East Linton multi-member ward and was both the SNP group leader and the council leader from 2007 to 2012. Paul has also been a board member of NHS Lothian, the regional offices of Scottish Enterprise and the Commission on School Reform. Paul, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
And Andrew, good. A nice fine morning and day here in Dunbar, so good.
It's certainly a little warmer than it was on Wednesday evening. That's absolutely right. So having listened to the update from Ukraine this afternoon, I was going to talk to you both a little briefly about what we're seeing going on there and what we're hearing. So Fiona, firstly coming to you, do you have any reflections on the current status of the war in Ukraine and the events that are being reported at the moment?
Well, estimates suggest that over 86,000 soldiers, these are conscripts, have also been killed. So Vladimir Putin is not only waging war on the innocent nation of Ukraine, but on his own people. And what's happening this week coming is huge forecast snowfalls and freezing temperatures. So that's going to severely impact on the civilian population of Ukraine struggling with their energy and electricity, keeping their homes warm.
Thanks, Fiona. And Paul, coming to you now, in light of the news and what Fiona was just saying, what do you think that we should all be doing, either politically as nations or personally and practically, in order to help with what is currently unfolding in Ukraine and what is likely to unfold as the winter intensifies?
Yeah, I think Fiona makes a really good point. One about the energy issues. I think that, in terms of logistically, I think the West should be trying to do as much as it can to try and help heat people in their homes this year, because it's obvious that the Russians are going to continue to target energy infrastructure. So I think that's an element that we should be doing more, is how do we keep people warm during what could be a potentially bleak Ukrainian winter. And I think when you see militarily, the Russians aren't making any progress. The Ukrainians are continuing to make this slow, steady progress. And I can't see any military win for Vladimir Putin in this in any way, shape, or form. But the focus at the moment, as I said, should be around about trying to keep people as warm as they possibly can. The West should be trying to look as much as it can in that regard.
Thanks, Paul. And Fiona, coming back to you, Paul's there talking about the energy crisis and the challenges of keeping people warm and safe in the face of the attacks which Russian forces are launching on the Ukrainian civilian population. What do you think this imminent winter is going to hold for the people of Ukraine?
I'm just so in awe of the resilience of the Ukrainian people who are facing these bombardments, attacks, these missile attacks all the time. And millions, I mean, it's the biggest migration crisis has faced. Millions have left their homes, but what they're doing is they're going to neighbouring countries to get supplies, to sort of recharge their own batteries, if you like, and then they're going back into Ukraine, returning there. I mean, it's absolute. The resilience is incredible, but for us in Scotland to do anything, all we can do is what we're doing now, which is taking in the refugees that are coming in, giving them a warm Scottish welcome, and to ask the people themselves, what do you need from a Scottish government or Scottish relief agencies? And you supply them what they need.
Those are certainly the questions that we should be asking at the moment, Fiona. You're absolutely right. And Paul, finally on the war in Ukraine, do you have any thoughts or predictions as to what we might see next? For example, either an escalation of NATO's involvement. I know that the UK government is sending helicopters this week to ostensibly to assist in search and rescue operations in Ukraine, or alternatively, do you think we might see a spread of domestic issues in Russia, as Fiona mentioned? The impact on the population of conscription and sending poorly equipped and ill-trained young men and women to the front, as that starts to the ramifications of that start to bite back at home in Russia.
Yeah, I think the West and NATO will continue to support Ukraine as best they can militarily. I think obviously they're very clear and not crossing the line when it's seen as offensive operation. So I think they'll continue to do the best they can. And as I said, maybe that should be around about helicopters and looking at search and rescue. But also, as I said, where can the infrastructure help them in terms of the energy we talked about? In terms of the Russian domestic situation, I think there are various rumours, and it's hard to tell that obviously Putin, and there are more voices outspoken in terms of where Putin domestically is coping with this. There are more and more stories coming out, about Russian generals and so on not being happy with the progress in that regard. I think you'll see that over the winter time. And militarily, I think there'll be slow, steady progress by the Ukrainians. I can't see any Russian progress in that regard. So I think the longer this goes on, the more Russian deaths there are, and the more people will continue to raise this. And obviously, the ideal scenario would be for Putin to be removed. Where it goes beyond the spring, I'm not sure. I can't see the Russians making any military progress at all, and then Putin may be forced into not to withdraw, possibly, but some kind of resolution. But I don't think there's any good situation for the Russians in this at all at the moment.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you both for your reflections on the war in Ukraine. I'm confident that we will come back to everything that we've been discussing and look at it further as the winter intensifies. But let's move on now, because this has unquestionably so far been a year of strikes, with 560,000 working days lost in August and September. That's almost twice the total for whole years recently, and industrial action is continuing to mount. These disputes all have the same root cause. UK inflation is now running at least 11%. The unions and their members want above-inflation pay awards to combat the cost of living crisis. Already, they point out, members' earnings have declined in real terms and are now worth roughly what they were in 2008. 14 years is the longest period of wage stagnation in modern times. If they were to catch up in real terms, pay awards would have to be at least 15% or more. Workers in the private sector are currently settling for below inflation increases averaging around 6%, but many public sector employers have yet to even match that with their offers. Currently taking action or planning to are train drivers and railway staff, nurses, college lecturers, Royal Mail workers, airline ground handlers, some Amazon staff, staff at Brewers, Green King, some dock workers, the teachers in Scotland, oil workers, about 100,000 civil servants, and ambulance workers, junior doctors, firefighters and teachers in England are just some of those who are deciding right now whether to protest. So Fiona, given that backdrop and given that list of those who are currently either taking action or are seriously contemplating imminently taking action, Fiona, do you think, are we heading for a general strike?
Difficult to know that. What I have seen is some of these disputes, the Scottish Government does have power to help offer increased wages. You know, our nurses have been offered a increased pay rise in Scotland, more so than in England. However, things like our posties, that's the Royal Mail, which actually our MP up here in Orkney will privatise. Thank you very much, Alistair Carmichael. And so our posties, our nurses, our social care workers, our teachers, these were all people who we relied upon during COVID, during those early years, the first 2 years of COVID. These were the people that delivered the services in our communities that kept us going. And a lot of them put their bargaining for wage increases and better conditions on hold because they recognised the impact of that pandemic and how important their services were then. And so we've not rewarded them for that incredible service they did for us during the first 2 years of COVID. Instead, they're having to actually campaign for better wages. And I certainly think, I don't know whether there will be a general strike, but they're certainly heading that way, that people are so discontented, so worried about facing their energy bills this winter that they're angry, and it just might very well be a general strike come early next year, say.
Thanks, Fiona. And just to develop that point a little bit, you were mentioning your local MP, Mr. Carmichael, and as you say, Carmichael and his best friend George Osborne privatised the Royal Mail many years ago. And just thinking about the depth of the shortfall in real terms in people's wages, which goes back certainly to 2008 now, do you think if the roots of this problem are so deep, how long do you think it's going to take to begin? If the UK government begins to take action, how long do you think is it going to take to undo 10 or more years of wages shrinking, and now the cost of living crisis on top of that?
Well, it can't be undone because the big thing, the big issue is Brexit, and that's been a complete disaster for Orkney and for our trade, and so you've got a whole load of impacts on the UK economy that have made it vulnerable to withstanding when things like COVID happened, and we've got energy companies reaping massive profits. And this UK government is not going to do anything to tax those guys, the way they should be getting taxed. So I see no way out of this. The damage to the UK economy is well and truly deep and will run deep for, well, I know what I think. I would like Scotland to be an independent country, and that's the only way I can see out of it for us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Fiona. And Paul, just for a moment to continue the point about a potential general strike. In 1926, after 9 days, the TUC General Council called off the general strike. The miners lost and had to accept longer hours and lower wages. And of course, after that, the coal industry continued to decline, as you can see in East Lothian. And that decline would run all the way through to the miners' strike in 84, 85, and the effective closure of the mining industry in Scotland and across the UK. So with that backdrop of what actually happened, Paul, do you think if there is a general strike with all of these different industries coming to a halt, all of these different workers, both private and public, walking out in order to withdrawing their labour in order to seek to improve their wages, if there is the same outcome as there was in 1926, so in terms of a general strike, do you think it's likely that it might have the same outcome as 1926, with the government succeeding and the trade unions failing?
I think it's unlikely there will be a general strike, and the reason I say that is that probably in 1926 it was easier for the unions at that time to negotiate with the government. I think at this stage, because we've got privatised industries and so on, that makes it hard for one simple solution or for one I suppose agreement to be reached if it was with the unions. I think there's a cumulative impact we're having at the moment of all these strikes, and you have to support the strikes that are there, because people's cost of living has massively increased since then. So I think it's unlikely, first of all, there will be a general strike. What I think will happen is you will see continued pressure from various unions in various sectors over the winter period, and I think most of the levers to deal with that, I think, would lie with the UK government. In terms of that, if you're talking about nurses, if you're talking about the rail strikes and so on, obviously needs additional monies from the UK government in that regard. We've then got the communication workers, and again that goes back to the days of privatisation and the Royal Mail. I met with the Royal Mail last week, and what they're trying to do is fundamentally change the terms and conditions towards that. And Royal Mail Communication Workers Union are concerned that they're going to move in towards almost 0 hours for some of the postmen and mail workers. So that's fundamentally, it's not just a pay rise they're fighting for the fundamental aspects of the terms and conditions of their job. So I think the pressure will rise. I don't think there'll be a national strike, but the UK government has to put additional monies into the industries that they look after in terms of that, and recognise that the part of the problem, and of course inflation is all over the world at the moment, but the UK is far more worse than any other country in the G7 and even in the G20 in terms of that, because of the mistakes that were made by Liz Truss and her government at the time. So we need more additional borrowing. We need additional monies from the UK government.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Fiona, just thinking for a moment there and expanding one of the points that Paul was making with regard to communications workers, and particularly workers working for the Royal Mail. Paul's constituency in East Lothian includes urban areas, but also some very rural areas. On Orkney, that's even more so the case, with smaller urban areas and much wider and much more remote rural areas, which some people would say, and I would say, means that it's often the case that Royal Mail workers, that posties, become lifeline service providers. Communities and individuals rely on them very heavily, especially, for example, in the Northern and the Western Isles, where private delivery companies either don't operate, or the charges that they seek to charge are so great that people don't use them. So do you think that there's an argument, Fiona, that, for example, with Royal Mail workers, their status, both in terms of their recognition and pay, and also their protection, it ought to be increased because of the importance of the role that they serve, especially in our rural and remoter communities?
Well, certainly our posties are fantastic. We do have other delivery providers in Orkney as well, and they're also excellent. Let me put it that way. But they don't have always the same terms and conditions of employment as the posties do. And one of the things about the postal dispute is that their workers would like all delivery operators, all those working in that field, to have the same terms and conditions, good terms and conditions that posties have. And as you covered, it's not just about pay. This dispute is there to protect the services we currently get and to protect the conditions these men and women are working in. And yet they're an absolute lifeline in our islands. We get, obviously we have local shops that we can go to, but we also have to do a lot of online shopping, and a lot of businesses here rely on exporting through their online sales. So yeah, our posties are fantastic.
Thanks, Fiona. I couldn't agree more. Paul, broadening this out a little bit, we've seen the Scottish Government negotiate with railway workers and reach agreement, with the nurses making an agreement which has suspended industrial action, and there are ongoing negotiations with the teachers' unions as well. So, Paul, why is it that the Scottish Government seems willing to negotiate solutions with all of these workers who are making understandable claims for significantly increased settlements and also preservation of their terms and conditions, whilst on the other hand, the UK government seems to be intent on blocking deals and refusing point blank to negotiate?
Yeah, I think it's an attitude and a culture issue in terms of that. I remember Ross Fryer, who's head of the STUC, basically saying that they might not agree with the Scottish Government on every issue that's raised, but they do know that the Scottish Government will talk to them, and that's comparable. There's comparable difference, obviously, between that and their TUC colleagues in England and UK government, who find that a real issue, even just talking to that. And I think one of the key things as well is that when you look at, for example, a nurses dispute, a level one nurse in Scotland receives around about £1,200 more than their compatriots in Wales. And level 7 nurses are receiving almost £3,000 more. So I think over that period of time, the Scottish Government has supported these sectors, the public sectors, much more than they have down south. And that's within constrained fixed budgets. So, and I think that will continue to happen over the next period of time. But it's an attitude and culture issue. The Scottish Government will always talk to the unions as best as it can to try and reach settlement, and what is an extremely difficult time for everybody when you've got inflation at coming up 11%, and you've got food inflation way higher than that, 15, 16, 17%. So, but the Scottish Government is operating within a fixed budget, and obviously constraints inflation. Inflation has literally meant the value of the Scottish budget this year is £1.7 billion less than it should have been at the start of the year when it was predicted. So it's a very tough time for Scottish Government, but it's doing its best as it possibly can, and hopefully move towards solutions with all the sectors we've talked about.
Thanks, Paul. And Fiona, finally, Paul's mentioning there that the Scottish Government operates on a fixed budget, and that fixed budget is being squeezed very hard by inflation. But do you think, is there anything more that the Scottish Government can do to encourage the UK Government to properly fund and fairer pay deals and protect the terms and conditions for workers, many of whom, as you and I have been discussing, would be regarded as people who provide lifeline services to our communities?
Well, I don't agree always with everything the Scottish Government does, but in this case, what can it do? I mean, John Swinney's already said he's having to make £1 billion worth of savings. So they'll have to come from other organisations. We're not funding other organisations, charities that might need the money, projects, worthwhile projects will get cut back on. So I don't know what else the Scottish Government could do. It's the old cap in hand thing, and it makes me angry that we're in this position at all. But my deepest sympathies go with the Scottish Government trying to do anything with this UK lot.
Thanks, Fiona. The sympathy is about right. But let's move on to our next item now, because I was reminded this week of the Sea Green project. That's a £3 billion project, which is a joint venture between SSE Renewables and France's Total Energies. It's located 17 miles off the Angus coast, and the first turbine out of 114 turbines was connected to the grid back in August. The project promises to generate 1.1 gigawatts of electricity, which is enough to power about 1 million homes in its first phase. That's the equivalent of about 60% of Scotland's current offshore wind output. Ultimately, they hope that the site will produce enough renewable energy to power 1.6 million households, and that would in theory cover 2/3 of all of Scotland's homes. However, the electricity that is generated is connected via a substation near Dundee onto the UK national grid. Now, SSE's chief executive, Alistair Phillips-Davies, has attempted to offer a solution to the current energy crisis, which has been accelerated in part by the war in Ukraine and which has pushed up bills. He proposed a voluntary scheme through which generators of low-carbon power, such as wind, can sign up for contracts to deliver non-hedged output at a fixed price, and that would help to reduce consumer bills. The merits of this solution were then later underscored because with the government's, when it emerged that the collapse of Bulb could end up costing taxpayers £4 billion due to the government's decision not to hedge. The surging price of gas has also sharpened the focus on renewable energy, but the problem is that Westminster has decided that all of our energy costs should be pegged to the price of gas. And that is because while in Scotland recently we have used very nearly no gas at all to generate electricity, in the southeast of England about 60% of their electricity is generated using gas. So Paul, firstly, is there any prospect at all of the Tory government in Westminster waking up to their chronic economic illiteracy regarding energy and energy policy and perhaps changing direction?
No, is a simple answer. I just don't think that'll happen, and we've seen that just in the latest budget, where obviously there was more costs put on to the renewable energy providers. I mean, I was speaking to Scottish Power during the week, and they mentioned that, tried to understand about why that is when they're putting more costs onto renewable energy providers. So and supporting oil and gas. So I don't think they understand the renewable market in terms of that. The biggest issue we have, the Scottish Government obviously will be producing its energy strategy before Christmas, but we have no powers over energy regulation, and that's the big issue. And again, it comes back to the benefits of independence. If we had controls over energy regulation, the issues raised about pegging the prices to gas and so on, and hedging would give us a much fairer market, and our consumers would see lower energy prices in terms of that. So I see no change from the UK government at all in this regard. I think they are economically illiterate when it comes to renewables and the opportunities around about it. Scotland has fantastic, massive opportunities. And East Lothian, you obviously mentioned about Sea Green, about that, but we have Inchcape coming on shore, Sea Green 1 coming on shore, and Berwick Bank coming on shore in East Lothian. There's around about 7 gigawatts that will be landing in East Lothian in terms of that. So, renewable energies has fantastic opportunities, but we need the powers of energy regulation to make sure that our consumers see the costs being reduced, and obviously seeing their bills being reduced as well. So, but I think it's highly unlikely the UK government will wake up to that at all.
Well, that's a very good point that you make, Paul. And just expanding on that a little bit, as you say, energy policy is currently reserved to Westminster. Does the current crisis suggest that, as perhaps the Labour Party might begin to offer, there is a further round of devolution of some policy areas to Scotland, and should there be demands being made for energy policy to be devolved, or on the other hand, should it be in the face of such a severe crisis, both in terms of the cost of energy and the climate crisis as well, which Westminster seems to be determined point blank not to address in a constructive or quick way, is there an argument now that the Scottish government should simply start to intervene in the energy markets? For example, either using investment if they can, or using social policy rather than energy policy, in order to try and improve the situation in Scotland, and also in order to try and show the way to Westminster as to how we ought to be going.
Yes, I think there needs to be do that. I think you have seen various initiatives. The Scottish Government, for example, supported the hydrogen industry with £100 million of funding. And so it can do that. Again, it comes back to the constraints around about having a devolved budget. You know, if we take that money, it has to come from elsewhere. We have no borrowing powers. And the Scottish Government has no borrowing powers. If we had borrowing powers, we could obviously invest in the renewable sector in terms of that and see the benefits coming through. So again, there's restrictions in terms of that. The social policy, obviously, we've talked about what we can do to try and look at the cost of living. And some measures that the Scottish Government has brought through, particularly about support for families. You know, the child payment is making a massive difference. So in a roundabout way, we can support that. And in a direct manner, we don't have the powers to do that. And I'm sure once the energy strategy is announced before Christmas, one of the key things that the Scottish Government will be highlighting is that we can do so much. But again, come back to the restrictions of a devolved country, is we don't have the powers of energy regulation and energy policy, as you said, where it could make a real fundamental change in terms. We just have to look at France, who restricted their energy costs to 4% rise, and that was because the French government had the powers to do that. The UK government chose not to do that, and we've seen the increases in some of the bills that we've had, and the help is only going to last for 6 months. So there's a lot more that we could do with the powers of an independent nation.
Thanks, Paul. You make a very good point. I was reminded during the week that in Germany, where of course they are reliant heavily on Russian energy, which has gone up in price, the cost of energy for consumers has gone up about 20%. Whereas in the UK, where we have no reliance on Russian gas at all, the cost of energy has gone up 300 or 400%. So there's clearly something adrift. But Fiona, let's come back to Scotland. Can you help us? What's the perspective on the current energy cost crisis from Orkney?
Well, let's put this. Last week, I attended consultation events about the West of Orkney wind farm, which is a massive development offshore of 125 wind turbines anchored to the seabed. And these will then export energy through cables, subsea cables, to the Scottish mainland, and from there it'll all be exported south. And that's your big problem. We export all this energy and into the national grid and then have to buy it back at higher prices. It's completely insane. And recently, the Orkney News published a fantastic article by Robert Leslie about what happens in Quebec with their power system, which is mostly based on hydro, actually. But they control their own energy in Quebec. Now, we're a nation. We're not a province of England or the UK. We are a nation, and yet we do not have those same powers. So, you know, until Scotland has powers over energy, which it'll only get with independence, we'll continue to export all of this energy south, paying back higher prices to get it into our own homes.
Thanks, Fiona. That summed it up really well. And I should say also a quick tip of the hat to unionist politicians everywhere. In the week that Arlene Foster has set up yet another unionist lobby group, Together UK, to tell the people of Scotland what we can and cannot do, we shouldn't forget her own economic illiteracy when it comes to energy. Because, of course, we remember the RHI Gate, also known as Cash for Ash, which she organised, will cost the taxpayer around £500 million to fix. But let's move on now. As Labour has turned its face against free movement and has doubled down on its immigration stance to appease the red wall in England, we should maybe examine what are the UK parties offering Scotland. Keir Starmer has abandoned Scotland by claiming a return to freedom of movement is a red line, and it won't come back under a Labour government. Speaking to the Mail on Sunday, Starmer ruled out rejoining the single market, customs union, or bringing back freedom of movement. Commenting, the SNP Westminster leader Ian Blackford MP said, Keir Starmer has perfectly demonstrated why pro-Brexit Labour has abandoned Scotland and will provide no real alternative to the Tories if he gets the keys to number 10. Brexit has been an unmitigated disaster for Scotland, he continued, and for its world-class industries, costing us millions. However, despite the economic calamity that it has been, there is no route back to the EU for Scotland under a Labour government. Not only has Keir Starmer ruled out bringing back freedom of movement, but he has also ruled out rejoining the single market or the customs union. The ending of all of these have been deeply damaging to Scotland. So firstly, a quick check to both of you before we get into this issue properly. Fiona, have you found any Brexit benefits yet?
No, a complete disaster for Orkney.
I thought that might be the answer. And Paul, have you found any Brexit benefits yet?
None at all. None. Generally, none at all. To myself or constituents in any way, shape, or form.
Absolutely, thank you. So, thinking about Brexit more generally for a moment, Fiona, are you detecting any preparedness in the UK media to begin to talk about what Brexit has done and what it will continue to do to families and to the economy?
Well, look, they didn't even cover it properly during the EU referendum. They smudged over everything, except in Scotland, actually, where we did discuss this issue properly. But still, people fully didn't understand what a disaster it was going to be. But despite that, places like Orkney, we had a very high vote to remain in the EU because Orkney's connections with Europe go back thousands and thousands of years. And, our European citizenship has been stripped from us. I'm just surprised people aren't more angry about it. But maybe because the media has tried to avoid talking about Brexit and the actual results of what that meant when we left the EU, the world's largest free trade market, and all that went with that.
Thanks, Fiona. And Paul, with you, if I can draw a nexus or a connection between Brexit and Westminster government's immigration policy, which some would say during the Brexit campaign, immigration policy was really what was driving much of the demand for Brexit in England, perhaps in Wales. Earlier this week, we learned that Rishi Sunak's potential plan to clamp down on international students taking what he described as low-quality degrees, but that could send many universities over the edge in financial terms. And that's according to the chair of the government's Migration Advisory Committee. So in terms of the impact of this and this plan, is this another argument for further devolution of policy? Is this an argument for immigration policy to be devolved, given perhaps the importance of the education sector and the tertiary education sector to Scotland?
Yeah, I think we've seen that. One immediate, obviously, impact that we had was the withdrawal of the Erasmus scheme, which obviously allowed exchange between, culturally and educationally wise. That was an immediate impact. In terms of looking at how it's impacting on Scottish business and just a number of people that used to work in Scotland and now that don't work here, it was almost immediate and overnight. And these problems are still arising. Now, that's been in the care sector, that's been in the hospitality sector, and that's been in almost in every sector in Scotland. We've seen that. The Scottish Government at the moment is talking to the UK Government about a rural skills visa programme to try and have some kind of powers over that, particularly trying to tackle issues around about the agricultural sector. Before the discussions, obviously that's been delayed because of the change in ministers down south. That in itself, is I suppose is the tip of the iceberg. If there could be some movement, that would demonstrate some kind of opportunities. I very much doubt the UK government will even come back and look at that. So we have very little powers in terms of that. And it does come back again. I know we keep on saying this about the restrictions of devolution. We have no powers about attracting people in from overseas, and we desperately need that. Scotland needs that. It's an ageing population. We need more people coming in from the EU and beyond to try and support that and help us adapt to do that. And you're right. There is no movement from either the UK government or the Labour Party at the moment, and it's damaging Scotland. It's damaging Scotland.
Thanks, Paul. And Fiona, let's expand that point a little bit. The SNP's Shadow Home Secretary, Stuart MacDonald MP, said, with the Labour Party merging with the Tories on the hostile environment, Brexit and austerity, it's clear that there's no change on offer at Westminster. He continued, the only way to protect Scotland's economy and get back on the path to prosperity is to become an independent country. So thinking of what Stuart MacDonald described as the merger between the Labour Party and the Tories on such a wide range of issues, Fiona, you can maybe help us. Have you been able to deduce what is Labour's offer to Scottish voters nowadays post-Brexit?
I don't know. I don't know what Labour are thinking of. They really need to embrace self-government for Scotland. They need to return to their socialist roots. They hold nothing for the Scottish people. I mean, pandering to a vote in the south of England will not win them any support in Scotland. They're completely out of touch. I just can't get what they're on about. And I have a lot of Labour friends, and you share many values together, but until they come about and realise that they're not going to achieve any of those whilst they're shackled to the UK and to the kind of setup it has, that, you know, always Scotland with 59 MPs will always be outvoted on everything. So until my Labour friends come around and see they're going to get nowhere with that, they're just going to continually shed votes across Scotland.
Thanks, Fiona. And Paul, to finish off this item this afternoon, I'll come back to you with the easy, simple questions to answer. I promise. I was reflecting on this issue more broadly. Do you think, and I appreciate we're still in the midst of the process at the moment, Brexit, I think most people would argue Brexit has not been done. Brexit is still in the course of being done. But do you think, Paul, is Brexit going to be the pivot, the inflection point which leads to the end of the UK?
I think it's certainly going to be an element of that. I think this is driven by politics, not by economics, by Keir Starmer. I think you've got the situation that this is all a debate between what they want to call the red wall, the blue wall, where Brexit, is the opposition to Brexit. That's what's driving Keir Starmer, is the politics, not the economics, because the economics in any way, shape or form are damaging Scotland and the UK. So it's narrow Labour politics that are driving forward this policy, not economics.
Thanks, Paul. Now then, let's move on to our final item this afternoon, because with it has struck us here at Broadcasting Scotland that within a couple of days of the Supreme Court's judgment, Scottish independence is being completely ignored by London-based media. There's nothing on Question Time, BBC Any Questions, Sophie Ridge on Sky, or Laura Kuenssberg this morning. So I was wondering, has Westminster and its courtier journalists decided that after the Supreme Court judgment on Wednesday, all that they will do is simply ignore Scotland, as recommended by Liz Truss, except maybe to talk up warnings of violence and division, and to talk down the ability of the Scottish people to do anything? So, Fiona, firstly, is ignoring the politics of Scotland as politics of Scotland and the politics of Scotland as part of the UK, is that a sensible long-term approach for the London media? And at the same time, just how badly do you think does the London-based, London-focused press fail the people of Scotland?
Well, the world is not ignoring that decision. The world is watching. And I can tell you now that on the Orkney News, small as we are, 10% of our readership is in the United States of America. And that is because they are very much interested in Scotland. not just in our culture and our landscape and our history, but our future. So, I mean, I don't expect anything from the London-based media because they would very much like to ignore it, and they have big issues to cover in England. Football and stuff like that. But in Scotland, it's a completely different uh, matter, and I'm hoping the Scottish media, with plenty of independent media now, continue to look at the issues that affect Scotland, and I know the world is watching.
Thanks, Fiona. And Paul, to come back to the Supreme Court judgment on Wednesday and the implications of that, do you think is it now the case that what could be described as all of the legal stuff that's now over, and it's all back to politics from now on, and as part of that, perhaps has the judgment and possibly the ending of all the legal stuff, do you think has that at all put energy and maybe some focus back into the independence movement?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, you and I got seen each other at the rally on Wednesday. Very much so. I think it gives legal clarity about where they are. What it doesn't give is obviously the political situation. And I have seen, and it was palpable in the Parliament. It was palpable at the rally. It's been palpable since that it has given energy to the independence movement. We know what we need to do. It's not going to be won through our unbalanced press. What it's going to be won by is our activists going out, having rallies, speaking to people on the doorsteps, convincing them of the messages that are there. Our case is stronger than it was in 2014. The unionist case is demonstrably weaker than it was in 2014. So we have to go out, we have to persuade people by knocking the door, by almost door by door. But there's certainly more energy in terms of I've seen in the last number of weeks, just since the announcement. So yes, we need to win it politically. We are winning the political argument. You've seen the Channel 4 poll that came out just after it, which put support for the SNP in terms of that at 51%, and the unionist part at 33%. So it'll be interesting to see where the polls go in the next few weeks. But I believe this will strengthen our message in terms of what we do. I mean, people are just seeing this is all the unionists have got left is denying us the voice. They have no positive case for the union in any way, shape, or form.
Thanks, Paul. And let's look at this from a slightly different perspective as well, because Anna Sarwar, Scotland's Politician of the Year, stop giggling at the back, has said every politician should be careful about the language they use. He told The Times that every politician should be looking to reduce the flames of the fire rather than put flames on the fire. That includes me and other politicians, he said. He said, let's not forget that there have been incidences of violence across the UK relating to people's political opinions. So again, a quick question to you both. Paul, can you think of any incidences of political violence in Scotland?
No, and I think when you see the language from the First Minister and others, particularly on Wednesday and before, this is all about inclusive Scotland being an inclusive nation. And that's the key message about that. It's been inclusive. The Brexit message was completely different, and you've seen rises in hate crime in terms of that. Our message is inclusive. It's including, and we've got support all across Europe in that. So no, I haven't seen any. The language is very, very different. It's all about inclusivity. So I don't see that. This is a case that once more, Anna Sarwar trying to be all things to all people, and it's not going to work. There's no evidence in any way, shape, or form to support what he said.
Thanks, Paul. And Fiona, quickly, again, the same question. Can you think of any incidences of political violence in Scotland?
Well, what has been remarkable about Scotland's independence movement is it has been so peaceful and so respectful, and of course, people argue and discuss things. That is natural. But as for hate speech, no, we have none of. We're an inclusive movement. We're here for all of Scotland, and we want to talk about it. We want to talk, especially to people who are undecided, or those who wish to remain in the UK. We want to talk to them, so we're not pushing them away, and we're very reasonable about it. So I have seen no instances of anybody, attacking anybody else. Certainly not in Orkney anyway. Few flags getting, shaken at folk, but that's it.
Thanks, Fiona. That's a very good point. So, Paul, coming back to you for a moment. So, in light of all of this and the points you were just making, why is Anas Sarwar lecturing the people of Scotland about things that don't happen in Scotland? Is it perhaps because he views every single thing from the perspective or through the prism of his head office in London?
I think there's an element of that. I think there's an element when he tries to portray himself as being the moderate man in the middle sort of thing, and that's where they almost sit in terms of in the way he sees it, divisive politics. The biggest problem that Labour have is, of course, is in terms of that's their rhetoric. Then we see obviously his policies in terms of Brexit, which doesn't support people in that regard. And I think that his policies aren't backed up. He then has a go at, for example, at the Tories, and then goes into coalition with the Tories and keeps Tories in power in various parts of Scotland. So the rhetoric isn't matched by the actions, and people will see through that. But yes, it is very much, I think, of him trying to portray himself as a middleman in Scottish politics. His policies don't back that up in any way, shape, or form in that regard. So yeah, and he is very much at the beck and call of Keir Starmer and his cronies down south.
Thanks, Paul. Now, Fiona, thinking again just for a moment about the context of all of this, I'm reminded that it's not that long ago that Labour politicians in Scotland were promising to, and I quote, bayonet the wounded pro-Scottish independence campaigners after the 2014 referendum. I'm also reminded that Lisa Nandy said that the way to beat Scottish nationalism was to look at the example of Catalonia. So, Fiona, why do you think violence obviously comes so naturally to British nationalists like these Labour politicians?
Well, they're trying to stir up something that isn't here in Scotland, and it's not going because our movement, as I've said, is an inclusive one, and we're very democratic. We want to listen to people. We want to talk to people. Anybody that goes to Yes rallies will see a wide variety of people of all ages and all types at them, and even folk take their dogs along and things. It's a sort of family type atmosphere. They're not political rallies like you might get elsewhere down in England, say. So they're trying to stoke up something that does not exist. And, the thing is not to even rise to any of that bait that they're trying to bait us with.
Thanks, Fiona. And to think and to reflect on what we've just been discussing in terms of the way in which Anas Sarwar and others have been mischaracterising politics in Scotland. Paul, we're now almost at the end of November. Looking into 2023, Paul, how would you like to see, or what are you looking forward to seeing from the independence movement and independence campaigning through 2023?
I think the clarity we got from the announcement on Wednesday, I think, energised the movement. I think we need to pick up on that. I think now we know more and more that we need to win that political argument, and for the sake of the people of Scotland, we need to win that political argument as best and as quickly as we possibly can. So I would like to see, the campaign being raised up further. We need to obviously work closer together. We heard that on Wednesday, all across the independence movement, and we need to continue to highlight the importance of independence and bring more people on board. We can see it from energy. We've talked about it today in the programme, from the likes of energy to how do we tackle poverty, to dealing with pay rises. We need the full powers of independence to do that. As I said, our case is stronger than the UK case at the moment. Their case is weakened. They have nothing left other than to deny our democracy. We will win out. We need to make sure we're winning these arguments, going out and speaking to people on their doorsteps as much as we possibly can in terms of that. And I have every confidence we'll do that in the next year, and support for independence will grow, and we will get our independence. I'm more convinced ever, even since Wednesday, in terms of that. So, but we need to be going out, knocking doors, persuading people one by one.
Thanks, Paul. And Fiona, to conclude this afternoon, the same question for you. Now that we're at the end of 2022, how do you think, or how would you like to see the independence campaign through 2023 develop? What are you looking forward to?
Well, this issue is too important to leave it all up to politicians. So what I would really like to see is a citizens' assembly, a convention, something like that next year, where all of Scotland can come together, not political parties, but the citizenry of Scotland, to discuss what's going to affect all of us. So when we regain our independence, we're building, and we need everybody to come on side. So it's not just a political issue; it's about winning hearts and minds. And we regaining independence with a cross in the ballot box. That's actually the easiest part of it all. It's what comes after. It's building our nation, and so a convention and assembly where we all come together and discuss these issues, I think is really, really important. And I would like to see that happening next year.
Sage reflection and very sage advice, Fiona. Thank you. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station and to make new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new supporters, which would enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you. Thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Click the little bell that you can see beneath the screen. Now, we will be back tomorrow evening at 7 with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. But meantime, I'd like to thank everyone who has been watching, and I'd like to say a very special thanks to our very special guests, Fiona Grahame and Paul McLennan. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, before we go, you may have heard that the former Scotland international Dodie Weir has died at the age of 52, 6 years after being diagnosed with motor neuron disease. Dodie, who was capped 61 times between 1990 and the year 2000, has gone on to raise millions through his My Name's Dodie Foundation following his diagnosis in 2016. The Loch was given an OBE in 2019 for services to rugby, to MND research, and to the community in the Borders. He was an exceptional man. People who didn't know him felt like they did. Those who were never in his company automatically referred to him as Dodie and considered him a mate. Some folk just have it, whatever it is, and Dodie was one of those. He brought out the best in people. Dodie is survived by his wife Cathy and his sons Hamish, Angus and Ben. Cathy has written, "We are lucky to have shared our lives with him, and we cherish all those memories. His love and warmth, his support and advice, his quick wit and his terrible jokes. It is difficult to put into words how much we will miss him." Our thoughts are with Dodie's wife and his boys and his immediate and wider family. Bye-bye.